The pounding of nearly a dozen heavy, clawed feet resounds around you as the beast meanders in. Crimson spines sprout from its back at seemingly random lengths and intervals, encompassing everything from its scaly brow to the tip of its gnarled tail. The beast's 8 clawed feet churn the ground below as it moves clumsily. Deep blue eyes seem to glow as it whips its head around, spittle flying from its open mouth, revealing rows of ragged, pointed teeth. This is the Dungeons & Dragons Basilisk, and I make that distinction, of course, since the Basilisk of real myth and legend has taken on many different shapes throughout history. We know it as a snake, as a lizard, we know it sometimes even as a rooster, but in Dungeons & Dragons it is a big fat lizard with multiple legs, a powerful jaw, and a predilection to turn people to stone. Let's not dilly-dally too much on this one. I am not happy at all with the 5th edition Monster Manual description of this one, and I want to get right into it. But before we do that, of course, as always, let's talk a bit about our sponsor today. This video is brought to you by the Sunken Isles, a new Dungeons & Dragons adventure coming to you via Kickstarter very soon. The Isles of Manatees are a cluster of islands created by a roaming deity that is cast into the ocean of a foreign world and left to grow on its own. Plants grow suddenly and without explanation, wild creatures are abundant and fantastical, and the people native to this strange land can speak with authority to nature itself. This is because everything in the Isles can be considered a living spirit, all of which are designed to work in a harmonious and communal way. As an adventure, it is constructed so that you have 20 weeks to save the Isles from complete annihilation. A week is roughly 1 to 3 sessions, and you level up at the end of each, which means, of course, that the adventure will indeed take you all the way to level 20. And the adventure will feature branching paths, choices, and then consequences for those choices, as you see the decisions that you make influence the story and come to roost at the end when a massive war breaks out between your allies and your enemies. Check out the link below and sign up to become notified for when the Kickstarter goes live very soon now on February the 7th. But now, on to the video. Alright, here's the 5th edition entry for the Basilisk. Let's see what it has to say. Travelers sometimes find objects that look like pieces of remarkably lifelike stone carvings of wildlife, missing parts that appear to have been bitten off. Seasoned explorers regard such relics as warnings, knowing that the basilisk that created them is likely to be nearby. Alright, well, nothing too crazy here yet, let's keep going. Basilisks thrive in arid, temperate, and tropical climates. They lair in caves or other sheltered sites. Most often, basilisks are encountered underground. This makes complete sense since they are, of course, lizards and will behave very much like lizards, so let's keep going. It then says, a basilisk born and raised in captivity can be domesticated and trained. Such a trained basilisk knows how to avoid meeting the eyes of those his master wishes to protect from its gaze, but it makes a daunting guardian beast. Because of this use, basilisk eggs are highly praised. Now this right here is the first contentious topic, the training of basilisks and how effective that can be for a person to tame them to do this. The reality is that it is not very easy or maybe even doable at all, but we will cover that of course in a bit. Next, we're told that basilisks are ponderous for hunting creatures, but they need not chase prey. Meeting a basilisk's supernatural gaze can be enough to affect a rapid transformation, transforming a victim into porous stone. Basilisks with their strong jaws are able to consume the stone. The stone returns to organic form in the basilisk gullet. Some alchemists are said to know how to process the basilisk gullet and the fluids contained within. Properly handled, the gullet produces an oil that can return petrified creatures to flesh and life. Unfortunately for such a victim, any parts lost in stone form remain absent if the creature revives. Revivification using the oil is impossible if a vital part of the petrified creature, such as its head, is detached. Now, here we have the second and arguably way bigger contentious point. This one is huge. Whether or not a basilisk can actually eat the stone of a petrified person and then gain sustenance from it. This is important, of course, since it is crucial to their existence. I mean, you could even argue that this is the most important part about a basilisk. The most important thing anyone should know, right? Because, I mean, if the basilisk can eat petrified people, then it should literally petrify every creature that moves. It is basically free food that does not spoil. But if the basilisk cannot eat petrified people, then it would only use it as a last resort in order to survive, since of course, petrifying a creature means that it can no longer feed off of it. But we will of course touch on this a bit, we need to keep going. Here we have the stat sheet. The creature has a lot of natural armor, like a lot. Whether or not you are considering that the creature is arguably taking a -1 to its AC thanks to its low dexterity, that is still a very high amount of armor, almost as much as chainmail, which is very impressive. The creature is strong but sluggish with really low speed and dexterity, not very smart either. Here we have its main ability, of course, its petrifying gaze. Nothing too wild here. If you meet its gaze, then you start to become petrified. It is important to note that it says right here that if the basilisk sees itself in a reflection, then it can indeed petrify itself. That is, of course, very important. And then at the end we have a normal bite attack. A 2d6 on its bite signifies, of course, an incredibly strong jaw, which is particularly impressive for this creature's size, which is medium, so the jaws are probably like crocodiles. They are meant to be very, very powerful. But then we have a bit of a surprise here. See, the bite attack does poison damage. You're left to wonder where that poison damage comes from, because there's absolutely nothing on the stat sheet or lore description about any kind of poisonous effect or ability. Now, there is of course a reason for this, but this happens every once in a while in 5th edition where they just don't quite give you the context. But you better believe it, there's always a reason for things to be the way they are. Now, without further ado, let's go ahead and talk about what the 5th edition Monster Manual did not tell you about the Basilisk. The first thing that I do want to clarify before I even start this part is that most of the differences that I will be pointing out are specifically for the Forgotten Realms. The Forgotten Realms is the default location where most of the 5th edition adventures are set. It is, in essence, the planet where all of these adventures are set. It is not the only planet, of course. You have the Magic the Gathering books like Theros and Ravnica, and you have the separated planes like Barovia and the Feywild with Curse of Strahd and the Witchlight book. But if you're interested in, say, Baldur's Gate 3, if you're interested in all these adventures from 5th edition, if you play the Dungeons & Dragons MMO, or if you read any of the D&D novels, then listen up, because I'm going to tell you how basilisks are supposed to work in this world. The basilisk is a lethargic and very lazy creature, and that is because its metabolism goes very, very slow. This has positives and negatives associated with it. The negative is that virtually most creatures can get away from the basilisk if they want to. If you ever encounter a basilisk and you simply do not want to deal with it, literally all you have to do is just run the other way. The basilisk will typically not want to follow you because it knows that it won't be able to catch up with you, and it wants to conserve energy. The positive to this, though, is that when a basilisk eats, it doesn't have to eat for an entire month. The way its internal digestion system works allows it to survive on one enormous meal a month, which is good since it is only likely ever to catch something just about once a month because, of course, of how slow and lazy it is. Now, the mentality of the basilisk, which you would imagine would be if you needed to struggle so hard to get just that one meal a month, makes it so that the creature is literally always hungry. Every single time it has the ability to eat, it eats, because the reality is that you never know when the next meal is going to present itself. And so something peculiar can happen that you would be fairly surprised about, because they're always hungry, and from a survival perspective they are encouraged to eat every single time they can. When they are, quote, presented with enough fresh meat, a basilisk will literally gorge itself to death, end quote. The reason the creature works the way it does is because it cannot feed on petrified targets. If it could, it would petrify everything that came into its general surroundings and could presumably feed endlessly every other day. But that is not the case. In fact, when the Monster Manual says that a basilisk can feed on petrified targets, what they are actually saying is half true. An adult basilisk cannot feed on petrified creatures, but in fact, a baby basilisk can. Quote, these creatures have something in their bellies that allows them to digest petrified flesh as if it were in its original form for nourishment. Meat turned to stone is all the young eat, however, and they seem to lose this ability once they mature. End quote. A parent basilisk will petrify a target close to its den, and then it'll bring its babies in so they can nibble on the stone and digest it for nourishment. The parent cannot do that. Now let's talk a bit about petrification and what it actually does to a person, since the concept of it is extremely relevant when dealing with these type of creatures. First of all, you do not need to be conscious of the gaze for its petrification effect to work. All that is required is for both eyes to meet, hence a basilisk can petrify a sleeping person, provided of course that its eyes are opened, and can petrify creatures that have no mental awareness of the basilisk, and even through materials, like for example a fish underwater could be petrified. Now, technically speaking, you can become petrified even if you're blind, depending on the nature of your blindness. If your ocular system generally functions, as in if your pupils have the ability to take in light into your eye, then the petrification effect is likely to occur. If you're blind because acid was thrown into your eyes or your eyes were gouged out or something like that, then of course the effect would not occur. Now, everything that I'm about to tell you was written by Ed Greenwood, who created the Forgotten Realm, so listen carefully. The eye of a basilisk produces radiation. This radiation is then absorbed by the eyes of other creatures when they see each other, or even itself, if the basilisk were to see itself in a mirror. Now, the actual magical process that follows is very much unexplained. However, we do know that a circulatory system is required since the magical effect produces a chemical reaction that travels through the bloodstream of the creature. Creatures without a bloodstream would then not be affected by this type of petrification. So, for example, you could turn yourself into gas using magic in order to stop yourself from becoming petrified. Creatures that do not have a heart that pumps blood throughout their body, like perhaps undead, would be assumed to be immune to this type of effect. Now, because the effect travels through the bloodstream, the implication would be then that the petrification process would start in and around your chest and then spread out across your body until it reaches the limbs. As a location becomes petrified, you would lose the ability to move it or feel it. It effectively becomes numb to you. If your whole body becomes petrified, then you entirely lose the ability to speak, see, or feel, and then become entirely paralyzed. Now, and this is very crucial, guys, it does not mean that you are unconscious, and this is the quintessential important aspect of petrification. Your body has entered into a quasi-state of suspended animation, as you have literally become stoned, which means your body will not age. However, your consciousness would still be active until, and this is the important part, you run out of air. This is very difficult to explain, but even though you are stoned, even though you cannot feel or move or see, you are still you, and you're still alive. Your soul is still stuck in your body. The way Ed Greenwood describes it is that for as long as you have access to air to breathe, then you maintain consciousness. Now, of course, you can't breathe while turned to stone, so you typically only last for about one round before you lose consciousness. So this will not apply for most people. However, if you were to have some kind of magical item that would eliminate your requirement to breathe, like perhaps many underwater magical items, or if you were to say be a race that did not require breathing, well, then you would maintain consciousness throughout the entirety of your petrification. If this were to happen, then it would generally only take a few hours before turning insane from the helplessness and the total isolation. Now, if you were petrified but conscious and you could cast spells without the need for somatic or verbal components, like for example if you were like a sorcerer with the subtle meta magic, then yeah, you could still cast magic even though you were petrified. Though remember that you still cannot hear or feel or see anything, so even though you could cast spells, you would still be basically useless because you would not be able to understand your surroundings. Psionic casters are still a very strong menace even whilst petrified because of course they tend to have ways to sense outside of their bodies. Also, based on this description of the petrification process, you can do 1 + 1 and end up with the conclusion that your belongings will not be petrified, only your flesh. So any kind of clothing, armor, or items that you're carrying will be safe from this effect. Now, the eyes of a basilisk are fascinating because they do actually a lot more than just petrify those who meet it. See, the eyes themselves just naturally exude this radiation that petrifies. It does so without the command of the basilisk. But the basilisk needs a way to stop it. I mean, you can imagine how disastrous something like this would be when, say, interacting with creatures that it wishes to eat, or when interacting with a partner or its own brood. The basilisk babies, for example, are born with the ability to petrify. And it would be a nightmare if the babies were just petrifying each other without a way to stop it, right? Right. So the basilisk has these two very interesting translucent membranes on its eyes that function like eyelids. One of these transparent eyelids comes down from above the eye while the other comes up from under the eye. While both of these transparent eyelids are out, the basilisk has a just natural, normal view of the world with a visual range of just about 90 feet. Anything after that becomes, of course, blurry to the creature. Now, the interesting bit is that the basilisk can control these transparent eyelids independently and can choose to up or drop them whenever it likes. And as it does, different things happen to the visual capabilities of the creature. When only one of the eyelids are out, the visual range of the basilisk increases, but it also grants it the ability to see radiation in the ultraviolet spectrum. This is what we call ultravision. It allows the basilisk to see gamma rays, X-rays, radio waves, and more. This effectively allows the basilisk not just to see in the darkness, but more than that, it allows them to see colors in the darkness, which normal dark vision cannot do. Though, of course, keep in mind that this works only outside and in a limited capacity while underwater, because that's where the radioactive waves from space would rain down upon the planet. It wouldn't be very useful while underground where there's limited radiation. And also, the basilisk also has just normal dark vision on top of this, so they're fine either way. But anyways, it gets even better. These eyes are amazing. The basilisk could also see into both the astral and the ethereal realm when only one of its eyelids are up. It couldn't, however, see all of it at the same time. It has to basically switch between them like a shutter. So you could, in fact, sneak up upon a basilisk in the material world if the creature just happened to be looking into the ethereal at that moment. Now, if the basilisk were then to drop both of its translucent eyelids so that there was absolutely no restriction on its eyesight, then and only then would the basilisk emit the radiation needed in order to petrify those who meet its gaze. It petrifies creatures in the material realm, it turns ethereal creatures into what is called ethereal stone, and automatically slays creatures that meet its gaze that are on the astral plane. This is really interesting stuff. So as you can see, the basilisk can indeed choose not to use its gaze if it desires. Now, the range at which you have to be in order for the eye to work and petrify you, it tends to be just about 30 feet on average. But that is for the average person. See, this particular range is interesting because it is actually dependent on how keen the eyesight of the victim is, not of the basilisk. If the victim is Legolas, who is trying to see with his elvish eyes if the halflings are being taken to Isengard, and instead he mistakenly looks upon a basilisk, then he will be turned to stone. An eagle can probably be turned to stone if it gazes a basilisk from all the way up in the sky, hundreds of feet above. If your eyesight is awesome, then you're screwed when looking at a basilisk. Doesn't matter how far you are. Now, the radiation produced by the eye of the basilisk is also interesting as well in that it can travel not just long distances, but it can also be transported through magic. Quote, cases have been reported of wizards employing wizard eye spells being stoned by basilisk guardians, and persons employing crystal balls, eyes of the eagle, and similar devices being petrified at great distances. End quote. It is also incredibly important to note that creatures like these, who have their eyes on the side of their head and not on the front, tend to be able to independently see in a 260-degree arc to both sides of their bodies. It is in the lore that the basilisk can indeed stone two creatures at the same time if those creatures happen to be on each individual side of the body. You have been warned. Now, all of this, of course, makes the basilisk seem incredibly overpowered, but remember that they're not just lazy, but they're also very, very stupid. A basilisk doesn't really understand much of what transpires around it. It can be very easily tricked into gazing upon itself in a mirror. It also cannot really be taught to do things. It is a common misconception that you can, for example, train a basilisk into choosing and picking who to stone, but that is a very, very hard ask. They are stupid as all hell, and did I mention lazy? Quote, like other reptilian creatures, basilisks are cold-blooded. They derive much of their energy from the heat of the sun and spend much time sunning themselves on rocks or heights to gather this heat. They will often creep up to campfires at night for the same reason. But unlike most reptiles, basilisks can tolerate a fairly wide range of temperature and can also store heat efficiently in their coiled digestive organs. Thus, they remain active on warm or mild nights, even in early spring or late autumn. Basilisks who live deep underground always have ready access to volcanic heat, and if these subterranean creatures are kept from this heat source for any longer than a day, they will grow sluggish and ultimately perish within another 3 days. Like their smaller king among the lizard population, a basilisk can regrow lost limbs and tails within 1 to 4 months, provided they have an above average supply of food during this time. End quote. Now, this is not a Mr. X video without reproduction, so let's just jump right into it. Basilisks can tell each other apart by smells. They're actually pretty good at recognizing different individual basilisks by their odor. When a duo of basilisks get together, they mate for life, and by instinct, they breed every 4 summers. When a basilisk needs to bang, they have to do it in water because of how heavy they are and how lazy they can be. It is frankly a lot of effort to sustain the mate's weight, so they have to do it that way. 2 days after mating, the female will lay a cluster of greenish-white eggs, typically ranging from 1 to 8 of them, that are about the size of a man's fist. The eggs themselves have kinda soft but fairly stretchy surfaces, which allows for a level of handling and manipulating that other creatures' eggs just don't get. For example, a basilisk will often carry their eggs in their mouth and then just drop them whenever they need to. They're also known to just roll them through the ground in order to position them wherever they want, and the eggs are expected to be able to withstand that. When the eggs are in a suitable location, the mother will cover them up in cool sand or will half cover them in cool, wet mud. Basilisks are extremely fertile, so it is almost guaranteed that every single egg will have a baby inside, and if they survive 4 to 6 weeks, they will hatch into basilisk babies, which really do look just like miniature normal basilisk. They will be 4 to 9 inches long, and like I said before, they will have their full-on petrifying powers from the moment that they are born. Now, an interesting thing is that during the nesting period, so during those 4 to 6 weeks, the parents do not eat anything at all, focusing extremely hard on the defense of their babies at all costs. This, of course, as you can imagine, makes them extremely irritable, and the more irritable that they get, the more fanatical they become about the protection of not just their babies, but of their general surroundings. It will take a baby basilisk just about 4 to 6 months in order to reach its adult height, which is about 6 feet in length, not counting their tail. The tail goes on for like another 5 to 7 feet, but yeah, at that point they will weigh about 300 pounds. For that whole process, the parents will hunt for the babies, like we mentioned before, by stoning creatures and then taking those babies into the petrified victim for them to eat. The babies will lose the ability to eat stone by the time that they mature, and as soon as this happens, they will leave the nest in order to find a mate of their own, and then repeat the process. Now, the monster manual did mention that you could extract a special liquid from the belly of a basilisk, which would allow you to cure a petrified person. Of course, now you know that only babies carry that oil, but other than that oil, the eyes of a basilisk are also worth a lot for magical users. The internal pupil, lens, and fluid of the basilisk eye is used as an ingredient in potions, spell inks, and the makings of items concerned with petrifying creatures. And then the inner membrane or eyelid of the creature would then be used likewise in magic concerned with protection against petrification. The intact eye of a basilisk can go for up to 1,000 gold pieces if sold to an alchemist. On the other hand, an intact basilisk egg can go for upwards of 500 gold pieces to people who still claim to be able to tame the creature into becoming an effective guardian. Now, before we finish the video, I did want to at least mention a bit about what's up with the poison effect that the bite of the basilisk has on the 5th edition monster manual. There's actually not a lot about it, and it comes from the 2nd edition entry of the beast. It's not even for the normal version of the basilisk either, but instead it is a specific ability granted to the greater basilisk, which is technically a different variation of the creature. These guys apparently back in the olden days had a very poisonous breath. They couldn't project that breath like, say, like a dragon could or anything like it. But if you were to, say, smell their breath, I don't know why you would do that, then you would be affected by the poison. The poison is more likely to be contracted at that point by the creature actually biting you than anything else. And it was interesting that the claws of the creature were also supposed to carry that poison. I think the reason that they added this poison is because the basilisk on the real-life mythos was supposed to be something like a snake. The basilisk is well known not just for its glare, but for its poisonous breath. If you read ancient poems, then you would find a lot of that. There's also old anti-Semitic passages of people, say, calling Jews basilisks, claiming that they spoke poison and stuff like that. It's a very old thing that basilisks were supposed to have poisonous breaths. So I would imagine that that is where it comes from, even though the actual D&D lore doesn't quite make a mention of how it works or why it is there. I would also like to mention that there is a very popular creature called the Dracolisk. This is what happens when a young black dragon mates with a basilisk, and you create an amalgamation of the two, which effectively functions like a black dragon that can turn people to stone with its eyes. Very, very scary stuff. I would like to personally thank my patron supporters Barry Maskant, 5e Magic Shop, Morgan Johnson, Rusty Rain, Doc Feeder, The Great Codini, Omega Scales, Terry Culp, Benjamin Bosters, Folky951, Ordoric, Sabim Kurshap, Thomas Hunt, Nathan McComb, Soulless Rider, Lost Crusaders, Stalia, Treb909, Tony RC, George Fortland, Sovereign Mind, Trevor Hess, The Living Guild Pack, Describe, Naxtor Ashura, Herbert Johnson, Brian Camp, Chad Aga, John the Wicked, Shane and Sam Skinner, Steven, The Wizard's Vault, James the Perverted, Shuddycast, Horrorbound, Jesse Feliciano, Munchkin Mania, Barak, Simon Landerville, Eliza Kestrel, Kristen Coleman, and Lactose the Intolerant for supporting me on Patreon at the $25 level. If you would like to support me as well, then please head on over to patreon.com/MrRex to support. Alright guys, thank you so much for being here. Thank you guys for being awesome, and I will see you all next time.